Hey folks, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we are going to break down the recent news that just came out where NaVi have benched JL, and in his place they have brought in Makazze from their academy team. Now, of course, NaVi was one of the teams that we had a lot of speculation about because we knew how much this team had been struggling and we knew that changes were inevitable. And I think for many of us, we saw many different opportunities for change, maybe even multiple changes at once. But they ultimately decided to bench JL and bring in Makazze, and so here is where we are. And so we'll get into that, as well as talk about where NaVi came from and how strong that they used to be, how much they declined this year, how much change was necessary because of that, and maybe what their outlook is like going forward. But before we get into all that, if you don't mind, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, please consider doing so. It really helps support the channel and help it grow. I know many of you who are watching are already subscribed, and I appreciate you for that. But if some of you out there catch this and aren't, it would be really kind of you if you could do that. Also, leaving a thumbs up and a comment down below goes a long way with the algorithm on YouTube and helping the channel. We've already seen a lot of growth lately, and it'd be nice to continue that trend. So I would appreciate it if you don't mind doing that. But without further ado, let's hop into things here and kind of just break down NaVi overall heading into this move, what this move might mean, and everything that goes around it. So before we get into NaVi's decline in 2025 and their need for change heading into the second season of the year, I think it's important to kind of talk about where NaVi came from, because this was a team that before Vitality went on the tear that they just went on and are sealing the first era of CS2, NaVi had an opportunity to do the same thing last year, because they won the first major of the year at the PGL Copenhagen Major, the first CS2 major. And then after a little bit of a bump in the road at Dallas and EPL, they went on a run of making 6 big finals in a row. Yes, they had the 6th place finish in a group stage event, but the spring final, EWC, Cologne, EPL, the fall final, and Rio, they made the finals of all those events and they won 3 of them. And so they were going to the Perfect World Shanghai Major as the favorites to win that major, and I guarantee you that if they had won this Perfect World Shanghai Major, there would not have been a open and shut case on the matter, but there have been a very serious discussion about NaVi having the first era of CS2 because they would have won both majors that year. They would have had 3 additional wins. They therefore would have been the winningest team of the year. They also had a stretch of a lot of consistency with these, 6 big finals here, kind of the second half of the year, plus being able to get the major in the first half and then finishing off through with the major. You would have had to at least have the conversation, was 2024 the NaVi era? Would have been fantastic, but we all know what happened. At the Shanghai Major, they didn't even make the playoffs. They actually got upset by Heroic, a team that had been on the rise, but nowhere near NaVi's level for the bulk of the year. They knocked them out and got the quarterfinal slot instead. And that was really the first step, I guess you could say, in the decline of NaVi after having such a wonderful year. Then not only were the results great, but this team was just so good tactically. You would call them one of the best strategic teams of 2024. They had a phenomenal system of, Ema being an entry fragger, but not being the only one that had to do it. You had JL and Bit who were playmakers on the extremities. JL had some extremity roles like Banana on Inferno or B on DusT 2. And then he had a mix of more active position as well, like, say, Canal on Anubis would be one example. And then you had Bit, who was, playing your extremity positions on a lot of maps, pretty much the entire map pool, and obviously was a fantastic anchor player. Wonderful, was a solid opper through the majority of last year. And while they didn't have a superstar talent that you would rank in the top 5 for the year, they did have multiple players that you would probably put in the top 10. Bit and JL certainly come to mind. And they just had a great distribution of how all the talent worked out. You had Alexi B, the fantastic in-game leader with Blade, the coach behind him, Ema being the soldier entry fragger and doing whatever the team needed. JL being an extremity playmaker, sometimes a playmaker more active roles, had a mix of anchor and rotator roles defensively, could be a great clutcher and make magical moments happen. Bit was contending with Jimmy from Esports as the best anchor defensively in the world for the majority of the year, but again, being an extremity playmaker. And Wonderful was a solid opper. You weren't going to consider him one of the best, but you certainly would put him up there as one of the better ones and certainly played well within this system. And the other really cool thing about this team was that anyone could create an opening. As you'll see in a second, they had a very crazy equal distribution of who would go for the openings on the T side, whether it was an extremity playmaker or EMA in kind of the main control group. And what that allowed them to do was when they play defaults, they could just react off of people making plays on any point in the map at any given time. Like the protocols were so well drilled on how they would respond and how they would be proactive. They mixed in pacing changes, they mixed in executes, and with that, they put together such a hefty map pool. I mean, Mirage, they were super dominant on it. Ancient, super dominant on it. Nuke and Inferno, not nearly as much, but they still had positive win rates, and they did have stints of prolonged success throughout the course of the year. You know, have periods or tournaments where they would have really good runs on both of these maps. Still, ultimately, they weren't nearly as high as their Mirage and Ancient, but then they also had a very good Anubis. They had a very good DusT too, and they did play Overpass when it was in the pool, and then when it wasn't, they obviously permaban Vertigo, and still just had a really solid map pool to boot. On top of all this, again, they did have good talent in their players. I mean, Bit and JL were top 10 players in the world, even though they weren't superstar players. I mean, again, you would expect a team that was ranked in the top 5 of the world and many times #1 and the winningest team to have the big star players, but they really didn't. You know, you had your Donk and your Ziwus and your Shiros and your Munasees and all these other guys, but they were on different teams. They didn't have that, but that's what made NaVi so special, was they found ways around that with their system, with a good, well-distributed stock of talent, good tactics, good map pool, and all the works, that they still managed to have, you know, a pretty just well-rounded team, and you could see it here in the numbers. Not only that, but as I was telling you, they were so unique in the fact that they had such a crazy equal distribution of who could create openings on the T side. You know, in a lot of teams, you have an entry fragger who's well over at 25%, like 25, maybe even 28%, or maybe you have a couple of guys who are in the mid to high 20% range. You have some teams where they're in the extremes. They have an entry fragger who's 30+% opening attempts on the T side, and so it's very top heavy in who is going for those opening attempts and creating that space. But on this team, look at this. You got Bit at 20%. You got JL at just around 22%. You got EMA at 24%, and you got Alexi B right at 20% as well. So you got 4 guys who are all in that low to mid 20% range, and look at the success rate. Bit, as an extremity playmaker, you know, 52.5% success in opening duels. JL, 49%. EMA, 46% as their traditional entry fragger. And yeah, a lot of top tier entry fraggers will be in the high 40% to low 50% range, but this is pretty damn good. This is in line with some really good entry fraggers. I mean, he really was playing well. And obviously, wonderful, doesn't really go for a lot of attempts, but when he did here and there, he was able to do it. And while his overall numbers for the year weren't that great, he at least was creating that space for his team, and they were able to follow off of it. And so they really did just have this kind of unique kind of quirk about them, that they had such a crazy equal distribution of the opening attempts and how they were able to build off of that. But again, at the Shanghai Major, it kind of came crashing down, and after a couple of high marks to kick off 2025, we really saw them decline. So they kicked off the year by placing top 4 at the first 2 tournaments. You know, Blast Bounty is kind of a weird format, but then at a prestige event, IM Katowice, they were able to place in the top 4 just as Vitality was starting their big run of winning everything for the rest of the year after Blast Bounty. But then you could see the results slowly kind of peter off. And while they're still off top 8 finishes, and that kind of keeps them ranked in or near the top 8, they still saw so many teams surpass them. You know, this was a team that was near the top of the pecking order in the top 5. Certainly the baton was kind of past the Spirit when they won the Shanghai Major, but for the bulk of 2024, NaVi was always a top 5 team, and even after the Shanghai Major, you would still put them somewhere in the top 5. But kind of similar to Spirit, actually, they saw all these teams pass them by. Vitality with their era-defining year so far of 2025. Mousesports, Falcons, you know, these teams really leveled up and surpassed them. But not only that, unlike Spirit was at least able to maintain like a 4th place ranking. Maybe you put him even 3rd now after Falcons' demise at the Blast Austin Major. But NaVi even started losing to teams they weren't supposed to lose to, and their losses against elite teams didn't even look competitive. For example, you go to EPL and they lose to Saul, a team they definitely should not lose to. And then, yeah, Mongols is a good team, but they weren't even competitive on their way to a top 8 finish at this event. Then, Blast Open Lisbon, 5th, 6th place finish, so better than the top 8 at EPL, and they did at least have a win over Mongols here, so they got their revenge. But again, not even competitive against Eternal Fire, of course now Aurora, and Spirit. Then you go to Melbourne, and it continues to spiral as Falcons again start to surpass them in the ranking and the pecking order. They're even taking big losses on maps to Main Brazil and FlyQuest, and they lose to Liquid, a team that was having their own struggles throughout 2025, and certainly not a team that NaVi was used to losing to. And then Astana might be the worst of all, actually, because there were not many super heavy hitters at this tournament, to be frank. It was basically Spirit, and then theoretically NaVi was one of the better ranked teams at this tournament, and there should have been an opportunity to make a comeback. Yeah, Mongols were there. Yeah, Aurora were there. So there was some other, low-end top 5, top 10 teams in this event. It wasn't completely barren of talent, but there was certainly a lot of room for NaVi to make a statement at this event. And while they had a close series against Mongols and they did beat Aurora, they lost to Astralis. And it was a cool story for a shot at this tournament. Hooksy coming in on short notice, limited practice, being able to rally the troops together and make a run all the way to the grand finals. It is magical from their perspective. But from NaVi's perspective, you should not be losing to a team like this. Not when they haven't had that much time to work together, and they had players who were struggling throughout the course of this year severely, yet they lose to them. And so at this point, they are just fumbling results. And at the Blast Austin Major, they had a bit of a bounce back by being able to the playoffs, and they did lose to Vitality in the quarterfinals. But still, it's just really, really tough to see a team that was, again, on the verge of perhaps having their own era, the first era of CS2, if they've been able to go back-to-back on those majors last year with all those other finals appearances mixed into it, being the winningest team of that year. Even if they didn't have an era, they were certainly the team of 2024, and there's still an argument to be made despite flopping the major that they were still the team of 2024 because they did have the most trophies of any team. I think Vitality was a bit more consistent with their results because they were really never having the flops that NaVi had just after the Copenhagen major before they kind of went into that final stretch. But still, the only win that Vitality had to their name was Cologne, and NaVi was certainly able to top that as far as trophies on the cabinet. But to see them struggle so much throughout the course of this year and to kind of just see them really not have any answers. I mean, they all but kind of admitted that they knew that they were behind when it came to firepower, and so they tried to supposedly compensate for that by going for a 7-map pool. As we'll see in a second, that certainly backfired. And even just the chatter around the team was super, super negative. And you could just see the writing on the wall that this team was struggling and could not find answers, and changes were all but inevitable. And, I mean, objectively, we could look at the results and see that this is the case. Just the language that was going around from this team in interviews where, essentially Lexi B at the end of Astana going into the boot camp before Blast Austin all but said they essentially needed a miracle in order for this team to get something going and be able to get back on track without having to make drastic changes to the team. Blade, kind of admitted that they needed to go for a 7-map pool to find some type of edge on their competition because they were struggling in so many areas. There was a lot of chatter around this team on all fronts that just really kind of spelled disaster. And then finally, the last thing we can look at is just their map pool completely plummeted. Like, I'll give them credit. They kept their Mirage up to a pretty high level, and they actually had Inferno at a pretty high level for the bulk of this year. Even the events they were struggling in, they were still able to really keep Inferno kind of at their locker, so that was really nice for them. But then after that, I mean, look at this. It just plummets. I mean, they used to be an elite team on DusT 2 in 2024. Completely dropped the ball on it. They were a great team on Ancient 2024. Completely dropped the ball on it. Anubis, non-existent. Nuke, non-existent. And yes, they did early adopt Train. They didn't really have many quality wins, and they got blasted by Spirit when they played one of the few teams who was quite good on Train. And again, in these losses that they were having on DusT 2 and Ancient and Anubis and Nuke, they weren't even competitive in a lot of these games. I was kind of showing you earlier. So just complete fumbling. And then on top of fumbling the maps, I mean, the players all struggled. I mean, just look at the stark contrast. Just rewind back, go look at the KD difference, the ratings, all that jazz, and you can just see that everyone has fallen off on this team. And I know JL will obviously kind of be the scapegoat now because he was the one that benched, but they really could have benched multiple different people or all at the same time. They could have done 2 changes, in my opinion, on this team, and I wouldn't have been against it. I think you could have changed out JL and Ema. And even though Bit had his struggles, I think he at least had something going for him. I know a lot of people will call for Wonderful's head, but I don't think people realize the opping market right now. For one, if you're NaVi, due to world situations that we won't get into very deeply here, they can't pick up Russian oppers. So they can't, go after a Muncie when obviously Falcons went after him. They couldn't do the same thing despite the fact that, Muncie comes from this group, right, or comes from this region, and that's despite the fact that Muncie did have a tie to Bit. They were good friends, and he respected Blade, and he definitely made a lot of language about how he would love to maybe play for this team someday, but it just can't happen due to the landscape that we live in, Dexter obviously wasn't an option for the same reason. And then after that, other than gambling on bringing Simple back, perhaps, because we saw what Simple was able to do with FaZe at the major, and the fact that he's already under contract with NaVi, you would think, maybe that could happen. But it just seems like that's untenable. It just seems like Simple and NaVi leadership are not on the same page, and it's just never going to happen, apparently. And so, other than that, the only other thing that they could have done was probably go after Sunpius or something like that before he went to G2, or they were going to have to gamble on an obscure talent like Fury did with Maladoy, or like what we're about to see with Grix. And they would have had to beat them to the punch and hope that that works out. And honestly, again, wonderful. To his credit, man, he was actually one of their better players at the events they were struggling in this year. You know, again, I know these are just kind of surface numbers, but again, he was their best performing player in pretty much all their tournaments this year, except for maybe the first couple. But certainly in this stretch, he was their best player by far. And I know that there were still, shortcomings. I'm not trying to, tout this guy as one of the best or anything, but he's still solid. And considering the Oppie market, I'm not against them keeping him. But certainly, JL was certainly a target to change. Certainly, Ema was a target to change. And in this landscape, JL has come out and he put out a vlog and he talked about how this is a mutual decision. And look, I think in every mutual decision, there is certainly one side leaning a little bit more heavily in favor of making that thing happen. And NaVi was certainly going to make changes after what happened this year and what happened at the major and just the current climate around the team. We knew changes were coming. And JL knew that too. And JL decided that he wanted to take a break and go do other things. And you can go check out his vlog where he kind of talks about this. And I wish him all the best. And I'm sure there's some truth to him wanting to step away to focus on other things in life and have a break and all that jazz. But realistically, I think he's going to be on the chopping block no matter what. And realistically, if JL had been performing well and JL really wanted to stay, then I'm sure he probably could have done that in a different world. But in this reality, where he wasn't playing very well, he was one of the targets, I'm sure, no matter what he would have wanted. Ema could have been a target as well, no matter what he would have wanted. I think Bit, even though he has struggled at times this year, I think he still has a lot of value in the roles that he plays and probably can have a little bit of a bounce back if other things go right. Obviously, Alexi B is still one of the better IGLs in the world. And again, I think with the Oppie market, Wonderful makes sense. But these players were struggling. And when I showed you that really cool stuff about the opening attempts on the T side from last year, where they all had about an equal distribution of opening attempts and they all had pretty solid success rates, not the case anymore. JL's down a lot, despite going for a similar number. Bit, actually pretty solid still, but he had points this year where he was not doing this well at all. Then Ema has gone down severely, and Alexi B is pretty much exactly where he was. And in fact, was actually entering more at the major than he had been throughout the rest of the year to try to change something up and maybe give Ema and some of the other guys some more favorable duels, and it was not working. And now the dust is settled, we know that JL is the one who ultimately got benched. So they are bringing in Makazze from their academy team. Now, Makazze, I'll admit, is not a guy I know a whole hell of a lot about, but I have seen some games, and I have certainly seen some promise. Now, he doesn't have the same appeal and, flashiness and eye candy that Kiyosuke had. He didn't have that same kind of hype around him from the community when Kiyosuke did make that move from the Spirit Academy over to Falcons. But this was certainly another guy that I heard a lot of people talking about who were covering NaVi Jr. and all these various online tournaments they've been playing this year, the CTCs, the qualifiers, the Yala Compasses, all these different online tournaments that NaVi Jr. were a part of when he's playing against teams like NIP, ENT, Passion UA, Spirit Academy, so on and so forth. This guy was putting up really good numbers. But he does have limited experience. For one, he has virtually no offline experience. I mean, the only LANs he's played is some really small ones kind of in his local scene. So really no LAN experience, even less than Kiyosuke has then, by the way. At least Kiyosuke played against some Tier 2, Tier 3 European teams with smaller LANs. This guy hasn't done that. And then really he has spent his entire career essentially on NaVi Jr. Like he joined NaVi Jr. in late 2023, October timeframe or so. Didn't really play on any teams before that, and has been on NaVi Jr. ever since until now when he's getting called up to the main team. But with that said, he has certainly looked good enough to merit having a look. I think it makes sense. And I think considering the market, considering all the other situations going around, I think, taking a shot on Makazze certainly makes sense. And there's even some other guys in the junior team that I thought looked pretty good too, that they could maybe even consider bringing in at some point. And he is certainly a guy who plays those more active roles. He is a guy who can go for a lot of opening attempts and have good opening success, actually, considering the amount of attempts that he goes for. I mean, this is pretty dang high. When you combine both sides of the map, certainly able to deliver. But how's he going to fit on the team is a question to certainly ask, because A, he doesn't have much experience. B, He's taking a huge step up in the level of competition he's playing against. He's also going to be playing big lands for the first time, really first lands ever, honestly, because again, only really small local events, only 2 of them. So a lot of things are going to change for him, and the type of player that he is not quite JL, as we'll see in a second. So it's definitely going to take some tinkering, but I could see this being a good pickup for them because they needed to do something, and while they could have done multiple different things, and they should have considered making 2 changes, in my opinion, they've only made this one, and so let's see how it's going to play out. Because if you want to get all roll sell, he's probably closer to an EMA than in JL, though he is a 1-for-1 for JL on some maps. So for example, on Ancient, he's a B cave guy, which is kind of what Alexi B does, but JL played B on the T side as well, so I could easily see him and Alexi B pairing up on the B side, keeping EMA at middle, kind of keeping the default structure roughly the same defensively. Defensively, though, it's going to be a different story because he used to play mid for his team, a more active role, a more forward role. That's the role that EMA plays, and JL is more of just a B anchor on this map. So they're going to have to make a change there, whether Alexi B takes the B anchor role and they let him at least play an active role inside B cave, whether they move EMA to B cave and let him have his spot at middle, or some other type of combination. They're going to have to make some changes here to make this work on the CT side in particular, whereas the T side, they don't really have to change as much. Now, on Anubis, he was a mid guy on the attack and then a Beacon player on the CT side. Now, this conflicts with Alexi B on the attack, but Alexi B could maybe go to Canal, which is JL's old spot, or I could see Makazze being a good Canal player, being that main factor at Beacon or assisting, at A main, and obviously still being a big part of whatever like mid-control takes they go for, executes they go for. So I don't think it's the end of the world as far as what he has played and how the team was set up that he's coming into. And then Beacon is the other active position besides middle, and JL played middle, so I could see him taking out JL's spot at mid, no problem. Or maybe EMA makes a swap to mid and he takes Beacon. I think they could really go either way with this, and so it's not the end of the world. Now, in DusT 2, it's a little bit different because JL is more of a B tunnels guy, and this guy is more of like in the main control group on the T side, which is what EMA is. But even though JL was a B player, he was still used in a very active way, similar to Tessus on Falcons, for example. So I could definitely still see this working out in one way or another, and maybe it allows EMA to take a bit of a back seat and allow Macazze to just kind of take the more forward roles, and EMA can maybe play a style that's a little bit more comfortable for him or something that might suit him better. I'm not really sure. Or maybe Macazze has to kind of adapt. We'll just have to see. And then defensively, he plays the mid-B rotator role, which is what Bit did, and JL was a B anchor. So that's going to take a big change defensively. Maybe Bit can just be anchor. He's known for anchoring on other maps, so maybe he could take this up no problem, and this isn't an issue. But we'll have to see. Now, he's a 1-for-1 for JL on Inferno and Mirage, essentially. Like, he plays the exact same CT spots as JL on Inferno and Mirage, and for the most part, he's a 1-for-1 for JL and Inferno on the B control as well on the T side, and they both kind of played roamer in aggressive roles on the T side of Mirage. I don't think that will be a big issue. Now, Nuke might be another trouble point because he was a yard player through and through on both sides of the map. This is EMA's role on T side, and Alexi B's role on the CT side. Now, I could see Alexi B sacrificing this, as some other IGLs have done in different teams, to make this happen, where maybe Alexi B goes and plays A door, they move someone else to A site. That way Alexi B can still kind of be in an active role where he kind of gets information everywhere, and then he takes the yard role for Macazze. Or, maybe something else has to happen. I'm not really sure. But with JL being a lobby player, this is going to be tough. I think Bit should probably take this, and then maybe you just let EMA play with Alexi B as like a roamer, and you let Macazze be the main yard guy, or the other way around. You keep EMA the main yard guy, but you still keep Macazze in an active role, being that second guy yard, that secondary yard player, or being a guy helping Alexi B entry, into ramp, or, upper executes, or whatever the case may be. But all in all, when you kind of look at it, it's not the end of the world. It's not a 1-for-1, although it kind of is a 1-for-1 on at least 2 maps. And I don't think they're that far off on Ancient either. So I think on at least 3 of these maps, it won't be that much of a transition. DusT 2 is going to be a little bit more of a big one. Same with Nuke, and he didn't play Train on NaVi Jr. That was their ban for the most part. So it'll be interesting, but at the end of the day, NaVi also probably needs to refine their map pool and not try to go the 7-map route anyway. In which case, they might ease off the gas pedal on Train or one of these other maps and maybe focus more on Train and give Macazze enough time to get used to playing Train with the team, and then it could still be fine. But that is going to basically do it here. I mean, the reality is this. NaVi used to be one of the elite teams in CS2. They were on the verge of perhaps even having the first era in CS2. They had a chance to be back-to-back major champions with a ton of other trophies in the cabinet as well from 2024, as well as have a consistent stretch of finals appearances in the middle of those two majors. They were right there, but it all fell apart at Shanghai. And in 2025, it continued to go down the drain, where they watched teams like Mousesports, Falcons, Vitality pass them by and go on to do extraordinary things, especially in Vitality's case. But not only that, unlike Spirit, they were even losing to opponents they should never lose to, and they weren't even competitive in their losses to some of the elite teams. At least Spirit held on to some of their status, where NaVi really didn't hold on to any of it. They have watched many teams pass them by. They've watched their map pool completely collapse. They've watched the results completely go down the drain. They've seen individual players pretty much on all fronts look worse this year than last year, and really nothing has worked for them. And so now this is the roster change that will hopefully bring them something. If more needs to be done, will be yet to be seen. I, again, feel like maybe they could have made one other move besides this one to really kind of get this team a new face and a new start. But at least this is something. Makazze is a guy who looks like he has some potential, and he is young, and he's already kind of come up in the NaVi system by being a part of their academy team, and so that should make the transition a little bit easier. But he's also raw, right? He also doesn't have that much experience against Tier 1 opposition. He has practically no LAN experience, so there are certainly some question marks out there, same as they are for Kiyosuke going over the Falcons, although Kiyosuke has a bit more experience, in my opinion, and just looked a bit more impressive, although that's not the Makazze in his roles and what he was doing for the team. He was doing at a high level. And so I think he can make the transition and be a new face to look at. We've seen plenty of other academy success stories in CS's history. Mousesports is practically all former academy players, just as an example. So we'll see how it plays out, but they have a long way to climb to get back to where they used to be. But that's going to do it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe, like, comment, and I'll catch you in the next one.